The Commission got litigation information and advice and provided direction on Pavunga Wetlands Protectors versus California Coastal Commission. It also considered a matter of potential litigation. That concludes the report on closed session.
Okay, so moving along on the agenda, this brings us to item 13. This is the Deputy Director's report for the South Coast District. This month, we have 4 permit waivers to report. We're not aware of any opposition to those items, and we're asking for your concurrence on this matter.
I'm sorry, where are you?
So this is
Item 13?
Item 13, the concurrence action for the Deputy
okay.
Director's report with 4 waivers.
Got you. Any objection to concurrence with the Deputy Director's report? Seeing none, we concur.
All right, thank you. Now, that moves us on to item 13A, and this is an informational-only hearing on the Ballona Wetlands. Now, before we launch right into this matter, I'd first like to provide a bit of background and overarching context, as well as provide a quick overview of how we'll be proceeding today with our briefing and the information that we'll be covering for you. Now, as many of you recall, this briefing is being brought to you in follow-up to a request by commissioners at our March hearing. As I mentioned, this will be informational only, and although the Commission may hold discussion on this matter and take public testimony, no action item requiring a vote is actually before the Commission today. Now, as many of you will also recall from that same March hearing, staff provided a briefing at that time on the status of a project by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which manages the Ballona Wetlands Ecological Reserve. Now, that was a smaller project than some of the projects we're going to be talking about today. That was for the capping of the 2 drainage structures that were installed without the required coastal development permit by a previous property owner. And in addition, at that hearing, issues and questions were raised by members of the public regarding not only those 2 drainage structures, but also regarding a much larger future planned comprehensive restoration project for the Ballona Wetlands by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And that is the project that is currently winding its way through the environmental review process. And as we had mentioned at that hearing, it's currently finishing the draft the draft EIR stage, and Fish and Wildlife is working on their final EIR. Now, some of those speakers also raised questions about, during several public comment periods and several emails that were directed to staff and commissioners, about several drainage and flood control structures in and around Ballona Wetlands. Now, to address these issues, as part of our briefing today, Commission staff will be providing an overview of both the permit history and select enforcement issues involving the wetlands, particularly regarding those structures that were brought up to you in many of those hearings, as well as a discussion of the Commission's involvement in the review and coordination of the long-term comprehensive restoration efforts for this site. Now, in addition, I'm pleased to note that we have speakers today from the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, the Bay Foundation, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And they will be providing an overview of the planned comprehensive restoration of the Ballona Wetlands, and they'll be discussing in much more detail the science behind that effort. Now, we have quite a bit of information to give to you today and several guest speakers, so although we'll be moving very quickly through a lot of very condensed material, I'd just like to point out that this will still take approximately 25 minutes to get through all these speakers and this information for you. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mandy Revell, the Coastal Program Analyst in the Commission South Coast Office. She'll be starting us off with a very brief summary of our past Commission actions within the wetlands.
Okay. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I think most of us know in this room that the existing Ballona Wetlands are one of the last significant wetlands areas in the Los Angeles Basin and are remnants of a much larger wetland system that formerly covered approximately 2,000 acres. However, a change in the course of the Los Angeles River, channelization of the Ballona Creek corridor in the 1930s and 40s, and dredging of the Marina del Rey Harbor in the 50s and 60s, which resulted in the placement of approximately 3.5 million cubic yards of dredged fill across the north and northwestern portion of the reserve, drastically reduced the size of the marsh to its present state. Of the remaining wetlands, approximately 600 acres is owned by the state, 500 acres is owned by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the State Lands Commission owns about 60 acres, including the freshwater marsh. The Ballona Ecological Reserve has been subject to several actions by this commission over the years, including approximately 10 exemptions that were issued between 2006 and 2017 to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to conduct routine maintenance and restoration of the reserve, including trash removal, non-native or invasive vegetation removal, and fence repair. 3 exemptions between 2003 and 2015 to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and non-governmental organizations for invasive vegetation removal. Approximately 6 exemptions between 98 and 2015 to various entities for soil sampling, mapping, and archaeological testing. And 4 exemptions between 2003 and 2008 for a non-governmental organization to hold temporary fundraising events. The Commission has also issued several coastal development permits for projects in the reserve, including a permit to Sempra Energy Utilities, the Southern California Gas Company in 2008, to reroute and replace a damaged wastewater line and to implement a restoration plan, restoration projects to various non-governmental organizations, including the habitat restoration of 9 acres of Ballona Dunes ecosystem in 2008, installation and monitoring of native vegetation in 2004 and 2006, invasive vegetation removal in 2016, and 2 permits in 2015 for the Los Angeles County Flood Control District to conduct non-native and invasive vegetation removal and structural repairs in the Ballona Creek Channel. One of the most ecologically significant permits approved by the Commission in the reserve was to McGuire-Thomas Partners, Playa Vista, in 1992 for the creation of a 26.1 acre freshwater marsh, which is located on the eastern end of the reserve. The creation of the freshwater marsh was a feature of a litigation settlement agreement that resulted in part from the 1994 case of Friends of Ballona Wetlands versus California Coastal Commission, in which the Friends of Ballona Wetlands and several other groups filed a lawsuit challenging the Commission's approval and certification of the County of Los Angeles Marina del Rey Ballona Land Use Plan, which would result in development of a large portion of the remaining wetlands. In 1989, McGuire-Thomas Partners, Playa Vista, acquired management and control of Playa Vista and worked with the parties involved in the lawsuit to resolve the issues raised by the litigation. Subsequently, McGuire-Thomas Partners entered into a settlement agreement with the Friends of Ballona Wetlands, the city, the county, and the commission, in which McGuire-Thomas Partners Playa Vista agreed to eliminate residential development on a portion of the wetlands, downscale commercial and residential development, and pay for much of its restoration, including a freshwater marsh and riparian corridor located just outside of the coastal zone. More recently, as has been the focus of much of the Commission's discussions regarding Ballona, the Commission approved the sealing of 2 unpermitted drains in 2017 that were constructed in the reserve without the benefit of a coastal development permit. The Commission staff is currently working with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to complete their current application to remove the remaining components of those drains. In response to the discussions before the commissioners at our March 2019 hearing, and subsequent comments received from Grassroots Coalition, who were threatening litigation over the matter, staff issued a corrected notice of intent to issue that CDP, which clarified that the applicants are required to submit a follow-up CDP application to remove the 2 unpermitted drains that have been capped. Fish and Wildlife has indicated that, consistent with the revised NOI, they intend to amend their pending application to include both alternatives for both removal and proper abandonment as co-equal alternatives for the Commission's review and deliberation, and we are currently working with Fish and Wildlife to complete that application so we can bring the matter to the Commission for action as soon as possible. In addition to the 2 unpermitted drains that were sealed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife in 2018, other drainage features within the reserve have become highly scrutinized by concerned members of the public. Andrew Willis, the Commission's Southern California Enforcement Supervisor, will discuss these structures in addition to providing context for the additional drainage features in question.
Thank you, Mandy. I'm going to focus on structures in and around the freshwater marsh. You can see its location on the slide that the public has inquired about. Specifically, the public has asked whether these structures receive the necessary coastal development permits. I'll be covering 4 structures, or 4 sets of structures. The number 1 is the Commission-approved freshwater marsh outlet, which outlets here where the number 1 is at the Ballona Creek Channel. Number 2, the commission-approved spillway, where the number 2 is. And number 3, the commission-approved sluice gate, which outlets where the number 3 is. All of these structures were approved by the commission through the 1992 freshwater marsh permit that Mandy described. I'll also talk about number 4. Those are the drains that the commission did not approve. Here are the 3 approved structures: the outlet, number 1, the spillway, number 2, and sluice gate, number 3, on the plans for the freshwater marsh. And this is a photo of some of the native habitat of the freshwater marsh. Creation of the freshwater marsh was approved by the commission as a joint habitat restoration project and water quality improvement project. Essentially, runoff from surrounding areas is directed into the freshwater marsh, where the water sustains natural habitat. The water moves through the marsh and outlets into the Ballona Creek Channel. The objective is that the water is cleaner when it exits. McGuire Thomas was the original permittee for the freshwater marsh. Playa Capital is its successor. Playa Capital is required through its permits to maintain the habitat of the freshwater marsh. Playa Capital established an entity, Ballona Wetlands Conservancy, to manage the marsh pursuant to its permits. This is a photo that commissioners might have seen as shown by the members of the public. It shows water exiting the marsh and into the approved outlet that flows into the Ballona Creek Channel. The second and third structures that I identified on that first slide are devices that were approved by the commission through the freshwater marsh permit to allow freshwater to run into the adjacent Ballona wetlands. Here's one of those devices, the spillway. Here's another such device. This is actually an outlet for the sluice gate in the freshwater marsh that allows freshwater to travel from the marsh into the wetlands. And moving on to the structures that the commission did not approve, which were installed in violation of the Coastal Act. Here's one of the drains that was constructed by Playa Capital or its predecessor in the Ballona Wetlands area prior to Fish and Wildlife obtaining the property that makes up the Ballona Wetlands Ecological Reserve. Although these drains empty into the freshwater marsh outlet, they were not approved by the commission, as the commission has found in its permitting, and serve no function in the freshwater marsh system. When Grassroots Coalition brought these drains to staff's attention, staff sent a notice of violation to Playa Capital asking for their removal. And there's been quite a bit of activity since then, including Grassroots initiating litigation to seek removal of the drains, and the commission's approval of a CDP to put a temporary measure in place that is capping of the drains. You can see here one of the drains now capped and sealed. The persistence of the drains on site remains an ongoing issue, and as Mandy mentioned, you will soon see a CDP application for the final treatment of the drains. And that wraps up my portion of the presentation.
And just so we keep things straight, I'll put my name in front of me.
All right, next, Dr. Johna Engle, the Commission Senior Staff Ecologist, will be giving a brief overview of the Commission staff's long involvement and coordination with other government agencies regarding the development of a long-term restoration strategy for this wetland.
Good afternoon, Chair Bochco and Commissioners. It's a pleasure to see you. I don't get to see you very often, so it's nice to see you today. Today, more than 95% of Southern California's wetlands have been lost to human development. This is the largest loss of any region in the nation. The Ballona Wetlands were once a 2,000-acre expanse of marshes, mudflats, salt pans, and sand dunes that stretched from Playa del Rey to Venice and inland to the Baldwin Hills. Now only about 600 acres owned by the state of California remain of the former wetlands. The EPA has determined that all the wetland habitats in the Ballona Wetlands are impaired, and the Bay Foundation's 2015 Comprehensive Ballona Wetlands 5-year monitoring report found that the wetlands are experiencing slowly deteriorating conditions across most of the areas hydrologically disconnected from tidal influence. Your staff ecologists and other staff have been involved over the years in various activities surrounding the Ballona wetlands, including the unpermitted drains and the large wetland restoration project. John Dixon, the Commission's previous senior staff ecologist, served on the Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project Science Advisory Committee, which provided science review, planning, and alternatives development for the Ballona Wetlands Restoration Project. I attended several meetings of the Ballona Wetlands Restoration Group and 2 Ballona Wetlands research symposiums. I have also visited the Ballona Wetlands many times, including the 2 unpermitted drains this past fall that Andrew just discussed and have been capped, and on 2 occasions spent almost the entire day visiting areas A, B, and C to discuss ongoing issues and the future restoration. The stated purpose of the Wetland Restoration Project is to restore ecological functions and services within the remaining Ballona wetlands, in part by increasing tidal influence to achieve predominantly estuarine wetland conditions. John reviewed the Ballona Wetlands Restoration Project draft EIR and EIS and helped prepare a detailed comment letter from Commission staff with general observations and specific comments that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife will address in the final EIR, EIS. Overall, Commission staff are very supportive of the large-scale restoration and believe restoration to a tidally influenced wetland system is based on sound science. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we are pleased to have some guest speakers today, including Dr. Eric Stein, Principal Scientist of the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, who will be providing an overview of how the Ballona Wetland Restoration Project fits into the greater regional strategy for wetland recovery along our coast, and some information on the historic ecology of the Ballona Wetlands. I would mention Dr. Stein also led the Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project Scientific Advisory Committee that Dr. Engle just mentioned, guiding the development of the restoration alternatives which were addressed in the EIR for this project.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be able to spend some time sharing with you today. I have really just 2 or 3 points I'd like to make in the limited time I have in front of you. First, I'll talk a little bit about what we know about the historical condition of the Ballona wetlands in terms of its relationship as a tidal wetland ecosystem. Second, I'll talk a little bit about the importance of the Ballona wetlands in terms of the regional recovery strategy that John Engle talked about that was recently ratified by the Wetland Recovery Project, which includes the Coastal Commission as one of its members. And then third, I'll talk about some of the considerations in terms of the future hydrology that are important to keep in mind as we think about restoration of this system in the future. So as you've heard before, I won't belabor this point. We know that this is a map of sort of the coastline circa 1870. We know we've lost a significant portion of our tidal wetlands over the last 150 years or so. And in addition to just the outright loss of wetlands, as this graphic shows, we know that we've also experienced a type conversion where a lot of our vegetated marsh systems have been converted to deeper subtidal habitat because of a variety of projects over the last 100 years or so. And in the Los Angeles region where the Ballona wetlands occur, this loss has been probably most pronounced, where that region of the Southern California coastline has experienced proportionally the greatest loss along the coast and the greatest amount of type conversion from vegetated marsh habitat to deeper subtidal. And so this is also the case in Ballona, and so this is an overlay of the current Ballona wetlands with an overlay of a mapping from the coastal maps that were done sort of in the mid-1800s, around the time that the California coast was charted for navigation purposes. So you can see that the extent of the coastal wetlands at Ballona were much more expansive, included the current Marina del Rey and many of the other surrounding areas prior to the construction of Marina del Rey and the channelization of Ballona Creek. And so if we look at these maps, this is the actual mapping that was done by the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey in the mid-19th century. These are spectacularly detailed maps, and they show us a nice picture of what the Ballona wetlands looked like sort of in that period of time. And so just a couple of features I wanted to point out, that this system was often closed to the tides through a sandbar across the mouth, which was typical of most wetlands in Southern California are naturally closed to the tides. It was predominantly salt flat, mud flat, and fully tidal wetland with a lot of seepage from the tides through the sand berm into the wetland. I've circled on there were a couple of freshwater inclusions in the wetland associated with some small groundwater seeps, but for the most part, this was a fully tidal saltwater system. And these are just a couple of pictures of what the system looked like around that period of time. And around the 2014 timeframe, myself along with some colleagues completed a historical ecology analysis of the entire Ballona watershed. And this composite map shows our best understanding of what the Ballona watershed in its larger sense looked like. And I just wanted to point out that in the coastal areas, the areas in purple and the adjacent sort of green and brown, that was the extent of the marine and brackish wetlands. These were marine brackish wetlands which predominated the coastal part of the watershed. And the freshwater, the large feature in the middle, those are the La Cienega wetlands, which was a freshwater wetland dominated by groundwater discharge. And so there was some drainage from that into the coastal wetlands, but the coastal wetlands were most definitely marine and tidal, fully tidal wetlands at that period of time. And there's just a little blow up of that area. And so moving to the future, so as we developed the regional strategy that Johna referred to, we looked at the wetlands along the coast. So this map shows the distribution of the 105 remaining wetlands along the Southern California coast. And as we developed this plan, there was a lot of thought given into how to create a mosaic of functioning wetlands along the coast. And so in the context of this plan, we set some regional goals for how much of our existing wetland resource we want to maintain and how much we want to restore. And so this is the science advisory panel that was responsible for overseeing the development of that project, so many scientists who have a long history working in this region. And so what I wanted to point out about Ballona, which you can kind of see where Marina del Rey is that in this portion of the coast, this is sort of the quintessential feature along this portion of the coast. And so if we think about in the context of the regional recovery plan, which really calls for restoring diverse wetland ecosystems along the coast, you can see that middle set of circles represents that the Ballona wetland restoration is really the preeminent part of the restoration of this part of the coast. So it's a really critical part of restoring this part of the Southern California coastline in terms of restoring the functions to the bight overall. And so as we think about this sort of conceptualization of one of the earlier alternatives, the last point I wanted to make is that it's really important for us to understand the history of the site and where it came from. But in terms of thinking about restoration strategies moving to the future, we're really more focused on our best understanding of what we think the future conditions will be like and the future constraints that we're going to be working under in this highly impacted environment. And so the ones that we're most concerned about are obviously sea level rise, which we expect to bring more marine and fresh saltwater into the system. And our best understanding is that we'll see a pronounced decline in freshwater discharge into these systems, and that's partly due to climate change and reduced precipitation, partly due to current water reuse practices and encouragement for recycling, which is driving most of these creeks to drier systems by diverting the artificial freshwater discharge that's currently in the system to other types of use like recycled water use. So my final point is as we think about the restoration in the future, we're really cognizant of the future hydrology and trying to think about the design of a system that's reflective of the future conditions that we're going to be operating under. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And following Dr. Stein, Korrina Johnston, Science Director for the Bay Foundation, will be speaking on the baseline scientific data gathering and reporting that substantially informed the EIR.
Thank you, Commissioners. Good afternoon. I appreciate you've been here for quite a while today. I appreciate your time in bringing this informational item to you and giving you a little bit of history and context for Ballona. I myself joined the Bay Foundation in 2008 and have been at Ballona for the decade plus since then, conducting research and studies along with many of my colleagues. I have a few slides here today, but I want to emphasize that a lot of information and data is publicly available on our websites. SantaMonicaBay.org is the Bay Foundation's website, and the Ballona Wetlands Restoration Project has a website, and that is BallonaRestoration.org. Many of the reports and all of these data and information are publicly available and fed directly into the EIR process. You have before you two very different pictures of Ballona. The top photograph is a landscape shot in Area A. While technically delineated wetlands, it does suffer from a number of impairments. And the bottom photograph is the most frequently visited spot in Ballona, which is the muted tidal channels in South Area B. I did not do this in a vacuum. There were dozens of scientists and researchers, expertise panels, scientific advisory committees, technical advisory committees that fed into the research that we've conducted on site. So I want to acknowledge them and thank them for all of their work. A subset of those names are listed on the board, but there are many more folks both in the room and external, some of which Dr. Stein mentioned as well. So you're a little bit familiar with the site now. Sorry, my voice, I'm getting over a cold here. The three primary areas of the Ballona Wetlands are designated as A, B, and C. This is the yellow outline is the current reserve boundary. I believe Brody will be speaking to that quite a bit more, so I'm going to skip past this, only to say that our baseline surveys comprehensively studied the entire site. So we weren't just looking solely at the wetland habitats. Ballona has a number of other habitat types as well, everything from dune systems to really kind of ruderal wetland systems covered in invasive species to higher functioning systems next to the tide gates. This is a habitat map that you see before you covering each of those systems. The blue shading colors are more wet habitats, purple and light blue are also wetland habitats. The light pink is a salt pan. That's a remnant feature that Dr. Stein mentioned from the historical ecology report. And then the figures, the polygons that have the kind of cross-hatching on them are predominantly invasive species and dominated by upland habitat types. So I had to synthesize about 1,000 pages of technical reports into the next 3 slides. And so I apologize if they are a little overgeneralized, but I hope that folks will follow up with a lot of the technical information if they're interested. Most of it can be found and referenced in the draft environmental impact report as well. Lots of the mapping data and species-specific maps that we created fed directly into the understanding of the site as evaluated in the environmental impact report and statement. So in addition to our work at Ballona, we are also part of a regional long-term monitoring program for wetlands throughout California and specific to the Southern California Bight as well. So we had the opportunity to put these data in the context of other wetland sites so we can actually understand where Ballona sits from a perspective of health and ecological condition compared to other sites. Any number of countless of these other surveys also fed into this information. We do understand some of the functions that are retained. Several colleagues and I wrote a very detailed paper on bacteria cycling, looking at some of the loading into and out of the wetlands. Things like that give a really specific research study angle on a little bit of the retention of the study, but the loss of that function across much of the habitat type. So there's a number of other studies and surveys, everything from fish, lizards, invertebrates, water quality, physical characteristics, topography, you name it, we have those data. And then another one that I just want to mention briefly is the California Rapid Assessment Method, and I'll be showing one slide on that as well. So these are just 2 examples of outputs of some of the data from these baseline studies. And on the left-hand side, you'll see a detailed species-level vegetation map, kind of painstakingly created both in the field using high-resolution GPS devices and through ArcGIS and online software programs. We have an idea both of where species are on site and how they are looking over time. And so one of the things that we can track is invasions of different species into areas over time. And so what we can see is that Ballona is not in a stasis. It is being taken over in many areas by invasive species. Again, this is not a site-wide overgeneralization. We have detailed information across the site. So what I'm saying is kind of equally attributed at a very small level and can kind of be scaled up to look at higher level invasions in different areas. So one of the things that we are fortunate to have in California is the California Rapid Assessment Method. I promise I just have one more slide after this. The standardized assessment method for the state of California was developed by a large group of scientists over many years and allows us to assess qualitatively and compare the state of Ballona to other wetlands in our region and throughout the state of California. So the numbers should not be interpreted for the exact number, but instead a qualitative assessment, kind of a category, if you will, of degradation. So we can see some of the areas on site that are highly impacted, have very little to no hydrology and struggle with invasive species, receive very low scores. Some portions of the site that are still hydrologically restricted, and that's largely due to the implementation of Ballona Creek, the channelization of Ballona Creek in the 1930s, essentially cutting off Ballona from its estuary. But there are still areas that have slightly higher scores with some native species. That's salt marsh pickleweed there, covers a large portion of Area B. And then there's some areas that are doing even a little bit better than that. There are some tidal channels on site. There are support for some rare species, like the Belding savanna sparrow has a nesting habitat within the salt marsh pickleweed. We can start to compare these sites with other wetlands in our region and recognize that even those like Los Cerritos, which has a number of very specific impacts, this has been before you guys before. However, Seam Shovel is one of the sites that's a small corner of kind of reference wetland within that site. And I believe you've heard of that recently with the gas mitigation. We can compare these to other sites. This is a site just outside of Moss Landing in the high 80s, and this is Carpentria Salt Marsh. This was several years ago pre-fire. It's suffered some impacts since then, but we can start to compare Ballona to some of the reference sites in the region. Anything over 75 or so is of kind of high quality wetland. I should point out that the lowest score that you can possibly have is a 25. So you can start to see some of the areas where Ballona is on the more degraded side. And we can start pinpointing some of those areas and look for areas where we can have functional lift or higher ecological condition, better support for native diversity of species. Very quickly, this is just to show you that in addition to the site sort of struggling from an ecological condition standpoint, from a generalist perspective, it's also declining in scores over time. So this is a time series of scores taken from 2012 to 2018, showing a very noticeable decline across the years at all sites in Ballona. So in conclusion, we have a real plethora of science and data that went into the environmental impact report, fed directly into the process. We provided data points, maps, information, habitat, understanding species lists, photographs. So we have a really kind of very dense compiled version of all of these data points, again, easily accessible through our website, santamonicabay.org. Again, we have some portions of the site that have limited functions. Those are addressed and acknowledged in the EIR. And then we have some areas of the site that are very, very much struggling. And we have a high level of impacts over time with the dumping of the fill from Marina del Rey onto vast portions of the site, the channelization of the levee, cutting the wetland off from its hydrology. We can start to really quantify some of those impacts over time. So I appreciate your time and thank you so much.
All right. And our last guest speaker today, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Senior Environmental Scientist and Reserve Manager for the Ballona Wetlands Ecological Reserve, Richard Brody, will speak as to why the land was acquired, ongoing management of the reserve, especially as it relates to a couple of recent points of controversy that have been brought up by speakers during public comment during several of our previous hearings, and he'll speak to the status of the EIR for the restoration of the wetlands as well.
Thank you, Commissioners, for the opportunity to present an overview of the Ballona Wetlands Ecological Reserve. This is an artist rendering of one of our restoration alternatives. This may be seen by a shorebird flying over the coastline. It says underneath the restoration project logo, if you can't read it from there, advancing ecosystem health, connecting communities with nature. A full overview of all things Ballona could take several hours. This is a presentation is very brief snapshot meant only to fit into the amount of time available today. The Wildlife Conservation Board met in September 2003 where the proposal to acquire much of what is now the Ballona Reserve was approved. The stated intention at the time, the promise to California taxpayers, was to begin planning for long-term restoration of the property to restore a formal coastal wetland that had been drilled for oil, farmed, seen the Ballona Creek channelized and disconnected from its historic floodplain, and much of the former salt marsh filled with dredge spoils from the construction of Marina del Rey next door. A historic image of this dredge and fill activity is the background image here. Here you can see the dredging out what's now the main channel, and here you can see it being deposited into what is now Area A. Thanks, Billy. One of the primary stated goals at the time, which helped guide the planning process forward, was to restore as much of the tidal circulation into the former salt marsh as feasible. The department understands that the only proven method to support special status species is to provide them with the habitats they need. The figure up now, and I'm going to fly through this because you've seen it 3 times now, is the approximate boundary of the Ballona Reserve, all located within the coastal zone. West Area B here provides somewhat functional tidal marsh habitat due to the installation of the muted tide gates. South Area B, in this area, is predominantly disconnected from any tidal channels, has remnant salt marsh that persists because of salty soils but is slowly degrading with time. And Area A, former salt marsh, filled with the spoils from the construction of Marina del Rey, and Area C, where the ball fields are located. The freshwater marsh that was discussed by Mr. Willis and earlier brought before the Commission recently is not a part of the Ecological Reserve and is managed by the Ballona Wetlands Conservancy, but there's always been plans to utilize the available runoff from the freshwater marsh to support restoration in the reserve, and these plans are analyzed in the EIR. I can say that we do have a great working relationship with the freshwater marsh management. Their biologist manager is highly qualified, and they have created one of the most important wetland resources in the area. The bird watchers love it. Here you can see one of the, this area here, the existing outlet and the spillway mentioned earlier, both designed and installed as potential hydrologic connections points to create a brackish system back in this corner of the reserve, but only when we first reestablish tidal circulation back in this corner as part of the larger restoration. On the subject of ongoing reserve management, this particular ecological reserve has a lot of moving parts. As we plan for the larger restoration, Ballona presents its own set of ongoing management challenges. For example, the Little League, you can see here, is arguably an incompatible use for an ecological reserve, has had a number of management challenges over the years, such as vandalism and activities, Little League activities during the bird nesting season. Additionally, illegal dumping continues to be a challenge. And of course, the unfortunate but expected issues related to managing an ecological reserve in such a highly urbanized setting, such as habitat impacts associated with neighbor encroachment, homeless vandalism and camping. It's a daily job managing, coordinating with law enforcement, and trying to educate the public. It's also worth mentioning that even community-engaged hand removal of ice plant at Ballona gets protested and becomes difficult to initiate at times. The Ballona Reserve has a number of legacy structures, including existing parking lots that have required a lot of recent attention, even though the future of these lots is analyzed in the EIR. The reserve is located atop one of the region's gas storage facilities, a mile below the reserve. We analyze in the reserve the removal of the gas company monitoring wells associated with this facility to help repair some of the habitat fragmentation occurring due to their presence. And lastly, the 2 drains the Commission's aware of, the ones we sealed last year. The EIR for the restoration of the Ballona Reserve. How we got here, where we're at now, and its current status. Quoting from our partners at the State Coastal Conservancy, who were integral in the early stages of EIR development and were funded to complete the planning process for long-term restoration, quote, the project team has committed to extensive public input throughout the process. There have been thousands of participants, unquote, and over 30 public meetings documented from January 2005 to January 2012. An impressive team of wetland scientists was assembled to develop a range of alternatives to, one, balance habitat restoration potential with environmental and engineering considerations, and two, to return rare coastal habitat to this property. Here's a summary of EIR project goals, stated in part to establish natural processes and functions by improving the tidal prism and circulation and creating a dynamic hydrologic interactions between Ballona Creek Channel, its historic floodplain, and the Santa Monica Bay, and protect and avoid impacts to existing infrastructure by maintaining and improving flood protection. This is why the levees must be moved to the perimeter of the reserve and not just removed. This graphic is taken directly from the EIR and is of Restoration Alternative 1, and it represents the highest level of restoration proposed. It is the most resilient to sea level rise, where under all other alternatives, West Area B, this tide gate sluice channel here, West Area B tide gates are predicted to become non-functional over time with rising sea level. In this scenario, about 200 acres of marsh and salt pan would be restored and or enhanced. In providing a range of alternatives, Restoration Alternative 2 represents the second highest level of restoration. It maintains existing conditions in West Area B, where we presently have partially functional wetlands due to the installation of the muted tide gates, providing muted tidal flow. But just as mentioned earlier, it would be subject to inundation and lack of circulation with sea level rise over time. This alternative offers about 148 acres of marsh and salt pan restoration or enhancement. Restoration 3 proposes the least change from the existing conditions and focuses primarily on Area A, where the most fill was deposited. It maintains everything south of Ballona Creek, this area in here, everything south of Ballona Creek as is, where we have degrading wetlands and former wetlands impacted from fill deposited from the construction of levees and roads. Here, a little over 50 acres of coastal salt marsh and salt pan would be restored and or enhanced. Alternative 4, the no project alternative, would continue the status quo. The department would, along with our partners, continue to implement non-native invasive species removal where feasible, but would not be able to achieve the stated acquisition goal of bringing back additional coastal salt marsh. Under this scenario, again, our engineering models predict that with sea level rise, the tide gates would eventually become non-functional, and it's highly probable over time we would lose what wetland marsh habitat we have now, the type of habitat that supports a population of state endangered Belding savanna sparrow, the type of habitat that this project under alternatives 1 and 2 strives to greatly expand. One of the project goals listed earlier is to develop and enhance wildlife-dependent uses and compatible public access. The department intends to meet this goal of connecting communities with nature by creating perimeter bike and walking paths and creating additional visitor usage opportunities. The perimeter paths would be separated walking and riding paths for safety and help create a feeling of solitude for walkers. Providing a perimeter boardwalk at the base of the North Levee along here for wetland bird watching along the largest contiguous area of restoration, which would be Area A, and providing Lincoln Boulevard and Ballona Creek overpasses for safety and ease of access to the reserve. These are these two line features here, proposed overpasses, and a spur trail into Playa Vista for increased local access by our neighbors, and that is this spur trail here. Next steps. This summer or beginning of fall, the department expects to finish responding to public comments and finalize the EIR. At that point, we will begin the preparation of design drawings with sufficient enough detail for the Army Corps to finish their NEPA review, which would allow the Corps to move forward towards finalizing their EIS at a later time. The department would start coordinating with Coastal Commission staff during this design process. Once project funding is in place, we would begin contracting and project implementation. Depending on the alternative, it could be a few years before initial earth moving is complete. Adaptive management and monitoring will be integral part of the longer-term implementation. Most often, all we hear is criticism about this project. I'd like to highlight the fact that there is a significant coalition of support from some of the most well-respected scientists and environmental NGOs in the region, and based on comment letters received, the majority of public opinion, especially people that live in the immediate area, More often than not, supporters of a project are not the loudest voices heard. The above organizations are part of a restoration principles coalition that supports science-based restoration in general, not just Ballona, if the wetland restoration project meets their principles. This coalition sent a comment letter with productive suggestions supporting Alternative 1 Phase 1, which is very similar to Alternative 2. But individual organizations within this group sent in support letters for Alternative 1 full tidal restoration. The department very much appreciates the healthy debate that these organizations must have had amongst this coalition. Final thoughts. The constellation of, I'm just going to read it straight out. We would like to leave the commission with these final thoughts. The constellation of legacy and management issues at the Ballona Reserve is complex. The EIR is expected to be finalized late summer, early this fall. The Ballona Reserve is in a degraded biological condition, and this restoration is of regional significance. There is broad support among the scientific community for this restoration. And thank you again for allowing us the time to present this information before the Commission. The restoration project represents the largest and last remaining opportunity for major coastal wetland habitat restoration in Los Angeles County, and the Department is pleased to use this opportunity as early permitting outreach to the Commission and staff in preparation for what we look forward to as a partnership in working together towards bringing back as much lost coastal salt marsh habitat as possible. The Department invites commissioners and staff out to see the reserve. Please come visit when you can.
All right, thank you. That concludes our informational presentation on this matter. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank all our speakers today, especially for their willingness to spend their entire day with us. And in particular, Dr. Stein, Ms. Johnston, and Mr. Brody. I would note that there are some other staff from the Bay Foundation and Fish and Wildlife as well. Tom Ford, the Executive Director of the Bay Foundation, and Richard Berg, the Environmental Program Manager for this area with Fish and Wildlife, are also here and available to answer questions. But on that note, I would just note that due to the lateness in the day, we are going to lose the majority of our speakers, and particularly Dr. Stein, who's already been generous enough to stay past his drop-dead deadline. Will need to leave very soon. So if we do have any questions, we typically move straight to public testimony. But if they're been asked, if you do have any questions for the speakers, it would probably be prudent to ask those questions now before moving straight to public testimony.
Yeah,
Thank
I understand. We have 40 slips, which obviously means I'm not going to be able to give you a lot of time per person, but we'll try to figure that out. So does any of the commissioners have questions for the scientists? Commissioner Uranga.
More of a comment than a question. As the commission knows, I sit on the Santa Monica Bay Restoration Commission, and as a result of my participation there, I get a lot of these updates as what's happening with the Ballona Bay, with the restoration project that's going on there, and I'm glad to see this high level of review that we've gotten today, because it really speaks a lot about what you're doing down there, and it's really important. And I see a lot of familiar faces out in the audience of individuals who come to the Santa Monica Bay Restoration, including Mr. Ford, who used to be the executive director of the Santa Monica Bay Restoration Commission at one time and has moved over. One question in terms of what was going on when I first joined the commission, there was a real issue going on with invasive plants, and especially the ice plant. And there was some kind of, I think, radical solution that was being considered to get rid of it. And I just like to get an update if there's been any progress with dealing with the ice plant issue.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. That was the Bay Foundation's project in partnership with Cal Fish and Wildlife. I would argue not radical. We were evaluating two different methods of removal. One was solarization, and one was hand removal of ice plant. Both methods were effective at removing ice plant. We did end up having solarization on a much, much smaller area. This was a CDP that we brought before you guys in 2016. It was approved, and we did move forward with the restoration. The total area is about 3 acres. And we decided to phase that very slowly in partnership with several other groups, and in order to kind of take it slow and do it piece by piece. Both methods were effective at removing ice plant. Some natives have returned. In particular, one area of the site is doing very well. One area of the site didn't have very much vegetation come back, so we're in the process of having revegetation efforts established now. So we're doing some native seeding and plugs of saltgrass, Distichus baccata. We also have had a number of weeds return, especially this year with the rains. So we are conducting adaptive management for those as well. So we have restoration events, public community restoration events. We encourage everybody to participate. They're on our website, santamonicabay.org.
There was also concern that the solar option was going to affect the wildlife that was there. I think it was a frog, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's
serves me right.
Yes, that's correct. People were concerned about the wildlife. I feel that we alleviated those concerns. We didn't find any harm to any wildlife. In fact, we rolled up the tarps and found several very large snakes and lizards and frogs happily sort of basking in the humidity that was underneath the tarps. So I hope that we alleviated those. However, we chose not to move forward with solarization due to the prevalence of some native species in some of the ice plant monocultures. So we determined hand restoration to move forward.
Commissioner Brownsey.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. In the interest of time, because we're very far behind on our agenda, I just want to acknowledge it's not that I thought the presentations from all the speakers were excellent to give us a good sense of the complexity, the history, and really the challenges of the Ballona Wetlands. And so thank you to everybody. But I also wanted to mention that in an abundance of caution, Council advised me to file an ex parte because I did have a conversation with Fish and Game with respect to all the various issues that they were going to be presenting on today, and that at the time we did not discuss anything having to do with the permit that may come before the commission in the future. But I just wanted to put that on the public record. And again, thank you to all of this, to the speakers and to the scientists for all of the amazing work you're doing to restore this wetland.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm willing to let the scientists go home because this is going to be very long, and it's an informational item, so there won't be any further questions of you. So thank you all so much for coming and really giving a fine report, really excellent report. Okay, now we're going to turn to the speakers. Here's what I'm going to do. First of all, Patricia McPherson, can you come up for a second? Where is she? There she is. Patricia, how long is your presentation?
I think I can do it in 15 minutes.
15. Okay, that's going to be the maximum because you have the most speaker slips. From there on out, I'm going to limit the group presentations to 10 minutes each. So that will be 30 minutes right there. And then once we get to the individuals, we will just most likely go through you really quickly, maybe just a minute apiece. So just hang on.
Oh.
Okay. So Patricia, you can start. You have 15. Everyone else has 10.
It's kind of hard to see from here. Patricia McPherson, Grassroots Coalition, and I do. have a bit of a concern. I frankly, perhaps I'm wrong, but I thought that the Coastal Commission was an independent entity that would provide its own comments from its own science-based people that were reviewing data. To have this meeting today and
Patricia,
discuss.
is this part of your presentation? Because you know
Sure.
what we're dealing with. This is a presentation? Okay, go ahead. I thought you had one up here.
It's a question with regard to the time, because we are given such a short amount of time,
Yes.
and yet they are given all of the time, and they are not from the Coastal Commission.
This, by the way,
So I'm just
is
asking.
an absolutely discretionary decision on our parts. You had asked, and we had asked, to have some informational hearing. We just had it. Now I have 40 people I'm going to try to accommodate, and it's 4:30. So 15 minutes, let's get going.
Just asking.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to go through the history of the Coastal Commission's influence upon Ballona Wetlands restoration, starting from the outcome in 1990 of that settlement agreement, starting from the land use plan lawsuit between the Coastal Commission and Friends of Ballona that ended up with a settlement agreement. That settlement agreement was included the Army Corps of Engineers, it included Friends of Ballona, it included CD 11, the Council District 11, and the State Lands Commission. As you can see here, this is a letter from the Department of Justice that has Peter Douglas affirming the fact that he is going to fully support the attainment of a full tidal salt marsh at Ballona Wetlands. And it says at the top here, I'm sorry, I don't have my pointer. The Ballona Wetlands Committee is made up of Playa Vista, the State Lands Commission, Friends of Ballona, and CD 11. That was a result of the settlement agreement, that they would have oversight of the whole Ballona area, including the freshwater marsh system in its total. Thank you, Rex. Here we have the, if it worked, am I going the wrong way? No. At the very top there, 5-91-463 is the application with the Coastal Commission, and you have on the left the Department of Army permit 9426EV. Those two are married underneath this settlement agreement. The description in that highlighted yellow portion at the top says for the Coastal Commission application that the Army Corps permit description is within the CDP. So they are tied as one. And Peter Douglas at the time was under pressure to waive the standard requirements for preliminary approvals from local, state, and federal agencies prior to the Commission's acceptance of a coastal permit on this for this permit application. So there was no science being done at the time. While all of this was being negotiated, it was being divvied up politically. And as you can see, the committee, who were the groups I just said, which was Playa Vista, State Lands Commission, Friends of Ballona, and CD 11, came up with the Ballona restoration of the salt marsh. Everything was pointed toward the settlement agreement of Ballona Wetlands goals and objectives, and the restoration would either be full tidal or a mid-tidal system. None of this was based on any science that was available at that time. This was all politically divvied up, and it was essentially hearsay. It also says in the yellow box down there, the estuarine is a coastal embayment. And that is essentially what we're talking about now. And why I'm trying to show this to you is to show you that this set the stage for the DEIR that we have now. I'm showing you why I believe we have nothing in the DEIR. There is no hydrology analysis. In roughly 2006, they got more money to do a hydraulics analysis, which was a quote-unquote unexpected hydraulics analysis, which was to see the waters coming down the channel. But for a wetland restoration, this does not have a hydrology study for it. And up here for the permit applications, all of the language relates to the fulfillment of the settlement agreement for 5-91463, but the settlement agreement in the lawsuit with the Friends and the others. And who again manages the freshwater wetland system? Again, it's the Ballona Committee and the Ballona Foundation, which is established by the committee to be those same players. Here we have up in the upper right, you see the land at the time, the land use plan, and all of the land on south of Ballona Channel there was already deemed to be wetland. The yellow portion is what is now the freshwater marsh, and above that was to be developed, as were the other areas. The California Coastal Commission relied on this language to approve CDP 591463, which was the freshwater marsh system. Freshwater wetlands habitat would offer greater productivity. The system would increase species diversity at Ballona, provide 52 acres of scarce coastal riparian and freshwater marsh habitat to declining species. Well, at the time, these are developers that wanted to develop on top of a piece of land that was a wetland. Playa Vista knew it needed to remove the groundwater. It knew it needed to create a flood control system, and knew of Ballona's freshwater ponding in Centinela Creek and Ballona. Here's a picture from just 1952. That is not a flood. That is freshwater ponding across all of Ballona. All of the roadways are elevated there. Here is a picture just 10 years after the settlement agreement. All of these are freshwater ponding areas that Playa Vista, in Area D, knew they had to get rid of, and are still getting rid of, and pumping and diverting the water and throwing it into the sanitary sewer, as I told you last time. Here is what Ballona looked like approximately 10 years after the settlement. Also, you can see Playa Vista's little hello center there at the intersection between Lincoln and Jefferson there, but you can see that all of this land has freshwater ponding all across it, including the area that's north of Jefferson where those illegal drains were that Playa Vista told you could not pond. The Department of Fish and Game told you it could not pond. And so therefore the drains were not doing anything. And yet we see it's ponding there, and as I showed you before, and thank you for the capping of the drains, it is now ponding again. This is all fresh water. Now here we go back again to the relationship with the proposed freshwater marsh system and the LUP. It all comes back again to the Army Corps and the Commission, all following the settlement agreement. And the settlement agreement is calling everything a saltwater marsh. It's hearsay language at this point. 1999, the settlement agreement, all lands west of Lincoln, south of Jefferson. The goals and objectives by the Wetlands Committee. Carrying out the provisions of a settlement agreement for reviewing applications and implementing the settlement agreement. That settlement agreement, by the way, was updated again in 2006. What's going on with that settlement agreement? Because the Coastal Commission verified the fact that they were no longer going to be a part of that settlement agreement, but they still reaffirmed their original agreement, which meant their original agreement had to do with the saltwater marsh theories. Meanwhile, this thing is updated in 2006 with the city and Playa Vista and Friends of Ballona. And how does that affect anything now? And how does that affect, and then here again, I've just got all the green. You can see all of this for the CDP as well as the Army Corps is all about saltwater, 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 and all of this language. There in the middle, you see the original committee that came up with their idea of what to do with Ballona. Those two red arrows point the areas that, as you can see in the picture on the right, actually were dug out from the channel and allowed saltwater intrusion into Ballona. At no time was a 408 done to determine what harm would happen to Ballona as a result of this saltwater intrusion. There was no discussion or inclusion of the hydrology studies that were performed by Poland, who is the grandfather of all hydrology in the LA basin, that knows that this area is a predominantly freshwater area. There's no Department of Water Resources mapping that was available, House Document 389, which helped create the marina. None of that information was used. All of this was available during the time of the negotiations. The current DEI predetermines Ballona's restoration as a salt marsh. It contains no hydrology analysis. Had we had an hydrology analysis, we would have seen the Coastal Act violations via those illegal drains. We would have seen the Playa Vista off-site pumping and throwaway into the sanitary sewer. We would see all of this flow. And we would see the fresh water that's being sent from the freshwater marsh into the channel. And we would understand those impacts, and it would be a part of what we were able to understand and try to protect Ballona and restore the fresh water to it. Playa Vista, that's the image up there is about 15 to 20 feet that they dewater, according to the water board, from the Playa Vista site, which is all thrown away. Why are they allowed to throw this groundwater away? Oops, wrong one. Again, we get back to the insertion of the square drain. While Andrew has said that there is a permit, it is a rather vague permit, but this was on the Phase 2 portion of CDP 591463 that did come in two parts, similar to the capping and the removal. That permit did too, and this was in the area of the second phase, and there is no city approval for that portion. Also, the release here, if we had had a DEIR that covered these issues, there was a Prop 65 case that came as a result of the sale of the land from SoCal Gas. SoCal Gas essentially lost in that, and because it was found that they were contaminating the groundwater. That groundwater is currently classified as drinking water under Prop 65 and is classified by the Water Board as potential drinking water. If this land is dug out to allow saltwater intrusion, that takes away that classification and takes away SoCal Gas's liabilities for all the contamination that they've provided to that land. And further, it causes further corrosion to all of the systems they have in that land. All of these issues were available before the DEIR was released, and they are not in there, they are not addressed. So I'm asking, can you lift some of these issues that happened before? Because as we see, here's DWR in 61, and even Playa Vista used it in the EIR for Playa Vista, that these are freshwater aquifers. Here's part of the Poland report. It shows that Ballona Wetlands is a unique and now very rare seasonal freshwater wetland. So the early stuff was based on false premise. The coastal freshwater drinking wells were in Playa Vista, which are written on here, and the Playa del Rey, which was then known as Palisades del Rey. The classification of groundwater, as I said, remains drinking water for Prop 65. Here's the House Document 389 from 1954. Again, it cites multiple irrigation wells in the Ballona area, and it warns of further saltwater contamination and dredging to remove that clay layer that's between it and the 50-foot gravel aquifer to try and protect these aquifers. Here again is freshwater marsh ponding, and today we do have groundwater protection laws that exist that should be used to protect this fresh groundwater. Ballona hasn't been given a chance. There is no alternative in the DEIR for a freshwater alternative. Why is that? Here's the Prop 65 lawsuit. Supporting the big dig of Ballona to bring in full or muted will change the designation of the groundwater from drinking water status. And the soil gas investigation, testing, monitor, and remediation will not be required, according to the red number 7 up there, as part of their settlement agreement. And it will take away their liability of contaminating what is classified as drinking water, which is precious groundwater. Here in 2006, this is the settlement agreement that was reaffirmed. The Coastal Commission said we reaffirm our 1994 stipulation to the 1990 agreement. But how does this all affect all of this? Because the Ballona Conservancy was never a part of this. The Coastal Commission, I have nothing that shows that they affirmed the Ballona Conservancy, which, according to, I get into the Ballona Conservancy here, is Fish and Game a part of this, I've asked, and they have said no, except that I've told you Brody has said, in communication, I have the emails with Mr. Huffman, where Mr. Huffman tells Brody that he can vote. Here we have Senior Mr. Berg from the department also just recently saying he's an active participant in the Ballona Wetlands Conservancy Board. And yet, to the left, you see the Ballona Wetlands Conservancy is cited by Fish and Game for a streambed violation for the roadway that was illegally built down there, plus the harm to the wetlands down in the other lower right picture there. So again, what is going on here? What are these relationships? And here again, we have the 1990 settlement agreement update. Pictures of this. Oh, on the right, it shows the Conservancy. The Conservancy is designed there to provide the costs for the oversight, or for taking care of the freshwater marsh. Well, we're totally fine with them taking care of the costs. But why do they have the direct oversight of this marsh? Why isn't an independent person doing this? Why are they allowing all this freshwater diversion from underneath Playa Vista to be thrown away? Why are they allowing all of the other freshwater marsh water being thrown away? And as far as SCWRP is concerned, here is the contract that came up. And what it says is they are to do a study to have the outcome be the preferred restoration alternative, which is an estuarine outcome. So they were hired, according to this contract, to come out with one outcome, a saltwater influenced wetland, and everything else was to be subservient to that. And indeed, there is no freshwater alternative in the DEIR. There is no hydrology analysis to even determine these things. Who's actually controlling this? I think ultimately the original agreements and the drive that was going on to divvy up Ballona back in 1990 played the largest role, and Playa Vista remains playing the largest role here.
Thank you. Okay, the next group is Ruth. There you go. Ruth Landsford. You have 9 slips. Or it's Ruth.
I'm giving it back this pointer.
Okay, come on now. Life is getting complicated. I know, yeah. So you're going to have 9 minutes.
I have what?
9.
Oh, I thought it was 10.
All right, you have 10.
Okay.
All
Okay.
right, slip one by you.
My name is Ruth Landsford. 40 years ago, I founded Friends of Ballona Wetlands with a mission to save and restore the last wetland in Los Angeles. It's a shame that we have to be here today. It's a shame that so much chaos and confusion has been sown by factions with no integrity. Organizations like the Ballona Institute, formerly Wetlands Action Network, both of which have had their nonprofit status revoked, have created and promoted all this propaganda, ranging from misinformation to malicious lies to idiotic absurdities, like the Friends are racist because we want to get rid of African plants. That's the latest. Over the years, the Friends have lived up to their mission. We have completed these 3 projects at Ballona. Every one of these projects was opposed by Wetlands Action Network, the Ballona Institute, or Marcia, Hanscom, and Roy Vanderhook under a different banner. First, the dune restoration in the 90s. When we began, the dunes were gutted with ice plant. With thousands of volunteers, we ripped it all out, replacing it with natives like dune lupin. Native plants that had been slumbering beneath the surface for years also burst forth. It was a proud and thrilling experience for the Friends. But there were problems. Roy Vanderhook showed up looming over the participants, accusing them of doing everything wrong, which was especially disconcerting for children. Part of the dune restoration was planting dune buckwheat to entice the return of the El Segundo blue butterfly, an endangered species. It worked. Every year during butterfly mating season, we have a celebration, public invited. I guess it's not very polite, but we do get to watch. Belding Savannah sparrow lives in the pickleweed adjacent to the tide gates in West Area B. It's an endangered subspecies because there's not much pickleweed left in urban LA. Until 2009, their population of 10 to 13 pairs never increased because of their shrunken habitat. The influx of salt water from the creek was shut off by flap gates installed by the Corps of Engineers back in the 30s, when no one thought wetlands had any values. Flood control was the only thing on the government's mind. Those gates were killing Ballona, and they nearly succeeded. Supported by then Congresswoman Jane Harmon and City Councilwoman Ruth Galanter, the Friends persuaded the new owners of Playa Vista to install regulated tide gates, allowing in limited salt water. The enhanced and now stable tidal flushing has increased the Belding's population for the first time from 13 pairs in 2009 to over 50 in 2015. The usual suspects claimed it was a trick so that Playa Vista could apply herbicides and that it was being done incorrectly and would kill the Beldings. As usual, untrue, not true. The southwest corner of Lincoln and Jefferson was plowed fields for many years. It had become what one biologist called a biological junkyard. But the Friends knew it was wetland soil. Our settlement agreement with the landowner required the creation of a 26-acre freshwater marsh there, plus a 25-acre riparian corridor adjacent to the LMU bluffs, connecting to the marsh under Lincoln Boulevard. Consultants were hired, and there they are. And the marsh was designed. But then Wetlands Action Network halted the project. They sued. Then came demonstrations, hunger strikes, actors changing themselves to Playa Vista's door, all protesting the killing of mythical endangered species by villainous bulldozers and claiming the marsh would be polluted. It took a year, but we prevailed, and those bulldozers went to work. Now the 51-acre ecosystem is flourishing. 250 bird species have been observed using the system since its creation, and an impressive number are wetland obligate species. For humans, the marsh is a tranquil oasis away from traffic and the buildings of urban LA. We've also brought out over 100,000 visitors and thousands of volunteers. We have education programs. Children from underserved neighborhoods visit Ballona. One even exclaimed breathlessly, "This is the best day of my life." And that was wonderful to hear. But most of this, except for the freshwater marsh, takes place in around 30 acres, the westernmost portion of Area B that still functions minimally as wetland. The rest, deprived of water or buried under 20 feet of fill from the marina, has been overrun by non-native plants and at times non-native predators such as the red fox, which almost wiped out all the wildlife at Ballona. After the state bought Ballona, the Ballona Institute suddenly and inexplicably reversed their previous position, which was, to quote Van der Hoek, quote, bring in more deep water to Ballona by removing any and all gates on Ballona Creek so full tidal flow will bring in bigger fish, unquote. In the blink of an eye, their mantra became no bulldozers. Restoration would kill the beldings and the butterfly, and other endangered species would be crushed by the villainous bulldozers. President Obama once called such people, quote, professional activists who profit from conflict, unquote. The Friends of founding members, along with other science-based environmental groups of the Wetlands Restoration Principles Coalition, formed to protect Southern California wetlands. Other members are Heal the Bay, the Trust for Public Land, LA Waterkeeper, and Surfrider Foundation South Bay Chapter. We agreed on 9 principles that must be met for a successful restoration. 18 organizations have signed on to those principles. When the Ballona EIR was issued, Wetlands Restoration Principles' first task was to study the documents, debate, and then agree on comprehensive comments from our team of experts, which you have. In other conflicts, reputable scientists disagree. Was Ballona historically salt or fresh water? I referred you to a paper and 2 articles supporting salt. Other well-qualified scientists say fresh. We do not endorse either side. But this is almost beside the point. Most of those 2,000 acres, whether fresh or salt, are gone forever. We have 600 acres left, surrounded by development and roads, and we must work within these formidable constraints. Our EIR comments and those of the Wetlands Restoration Principles Coalition illustrate how we can restore Ballona as we did the freshwater marsh within those constraints. We are all devoted to one cause, Ballona restoration. Why did the state spend the money to buy Ballona? Not just to keep a pleasant playground for humans. No, they bought Ballona to save and restore a wetland. For over 40 years, we've been wrangling, filing lawsuits, propagandizing, fighting, while Ballona's deterioration continues. The invasion is relentless. This year's heavy rains brought a deluge of black mustard and garland chrysanthemums, demonstrating how little wetland is left. We enjoy the temporary golden glory, heedless of the message of doom for Ballona. Restoration will bring to Ballona a new water-dominated ecosystem, full of wildlife drawn to its resting, nesting, and feeding place. Fish will once again seek out the nursery of its quiet streams. Wildlife that only lives because of this unique place between land and sea and others like it will return. People will not be excluded. Well-regulated trail systems will invite the public to a newly restored Ballona, encouraging future stewards and teaching visitors about the part it plays in the living drama of our world. We owe this place. We who almost destroyed it must repay that debt. 40 years is too long. It's time for the games, the wrangling, the conflicts, the bureaucratic delays to end. It's time to bring back Ballona. Thank you.
Marcia Hanscom.
You ready? Are you ready? Yes?
Would you get started, please?
Yes. Okay, Honorable Commissioners, Marcia Hanscom with the Ballona Institute. We are a part of the Protect Playa Now Coalition. I also chair the Sierra Club Ballona Wetlands Restoration Committee, and the Sierra Club endorses these views. Ballona Wetlands. Do gas and water mix in an ecological reserve? Uh-oh. Okay. The Ballona Wetlands is a state ecological reserve, as you've heard. The mineral rights, however, below belong to Southern California Gas. And you can see there are new drilling rigs that go up regularly. Are they all permitted? That's a big question. Oh, sorry. Also immediately adjacent to highly flammable eucalyptus grove, monarch butterfly roost, site for great horned owl and red-tailed hawk nests. And again, these questions are these permitted? We don't know, and we would like to get to the bottom of it, because we think that the SoCal Gas is a big part of this project you are looking at. There are chemicals, gas rigs, they're too close to wildlife, and really this storage field needs to be shut down. There are new unpermitted infrastructure, we believe, here. They've added lights, bridges. There are nocturnal species here. And you can see there are infrastructure parts of SoCal Gas throughout the site, including extraction wells and this oil well here that is covered by non-native species that for some reason Friends of Ballona Wetlands and others don't want to remove because they're hiding a lot of this infrastructure. There was an unplanned gas release on January 6, 2013, and it was only one of many, but you can see this picture here. There also are Proposition 65 warnings throughout the ecological reserve that says that obviously chemicals are known to cause cancer. And some of you may have heard of the Aliso Canyon Porter Ranch blowout. This one's in the coastal zone, and you have jurisdiction. This is an older gas site than the one that blew in Aliso Canyon. And just down the road here, on Via Marina and Tahiti Way, on January 11th, Dogger had to issue an emergency order because there was a blowout here. And it's still not plugged to the state standards. You can see here a worker escaping the gas blowout. And there's video actually on YouTube if you want to take a look at it. But the bottom line is gas is not a renewable resource. And supposedly we're trying to change that in this area. And this project, this fake restoration project you are looking at, is actually going to help SoCal Gas stay longer. We want to close down this site. These are just some of the wells that are just to the north of the site. There are hundreds of wells in and around the ecological reserve. And some of those are proposed to be dug up in this plan, just like this one that was dug up for a hotel driveway and blew. Do we want to really look at that kind of risk? And according to the Army Corps permit issues that were submitted to the Army Corps, SoCal Gas is one of the 4 people on the management team, SEMPRA, the parent company of SoCal Gas. Now, you can see here that these are white-tailed kites. White-tailed kites actually have their own law in California before the Endangered Species Act that is supposed to protect them. And we would like to suggest that another reason for no bulldozing besides the wildlife safety and the public safety is we should not have this big, deep excavation where there might be another blowout. Now, I'd like to also have you look at some of the things that were in your own Coastal Commission staff report comments. They said on page 38.8, the EIR states that routine surface monitoring of SoCalGas wells found storage gas were reaching the surface through leaks and along the well casings in wells that biogenic gas was detected. And there are important questions your own staff asked. Where are the 3 leaking wells located? Where are the 4 reabandoned wells located? These questions have not yet been answered. We hope they'll be answered in the final EIR, but they were important questions that your staff asked, and I'm really disappointed that they haven't been talking about this to you, because the gas field is underneath the Ballona Wetlands. There are gas wells throughout the ecological reserve, and it's just not being paid attention to as it needs to be. They also say once the wetland is, quote, restored, it will become harder and result in more impacts to address poorly abandoned or leaking wells. That's why we think the emphasis should really be at the entire ecological reserve is protect not just the Belding savanna sparrow that you did hear about. There are 8 endangered species that rely on this site. There are dozens of species on the special concern list for the state of California. If this were a private applicant, your staff would tell them to go back and start over, that this would never be approved. You don't take when they talk about restoration, they're talking about bulldozing, excavating the entire site. We've seen the documents given to the Army Corps of Engineers, and they say, clear and grub everywhere. Clear and grub. So here's the bottom line. SoCalGas will add new fossil fuel infrastructure as part of this project. SOMAS, the engineering firm, has already received $3 million for just putting engineering drawings together for the Army Corps of Engineers. That was our Proposition 12 money we worked for that was supposed to acquire more land or do genuine restoration, not do engineering drawings. So who else benefits? SoCal Edison and Chevron. These are both customers of the storage field beneath the wetlands. They get lower prices for their gas to fuel their operations. Again, I just want to emphasize, this were proposed by a private entity. In the 30 years I've been coming to Coastal Commission meetings, I can tell you that I know the staff would tell the applicant that such a project would not be permitted in the coastal zone. So we would like you to tell California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the State Lands Commission, who owns 60 acres, which they've been pretty much not part of the discussion the last few years, that they need to work on regulating the mineral and surface rights of SoCalGas and work toward shutting down this climate change impacting facility. And then we say, yes, no bulldozing, no gas storage, protect the 8 endangered species and dozens of species on the California list of species of special concern. This El Segundo blue butterfly on the left, that wasn't there when the land was purchased. When we worked with Governor Gray Davis to acquire this land, much more land than the Friends and Playa Vista wanted and had agreed in their settlement, we wanted more land. And at that time, that butterfly was not present. It is now, not because of bulldozers, because people did some hand restoration. Same with the Leesbell's vireo that I showed you earlier. That endangered species has come back since the land was acquired. No bulldozers. It's really a result of federal actions, recovery team of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and allowing that bird species to do better down at Camp Pendleton so it could come up north in recovery into this area. So what does the East Bellsbury need? Willows. That question has never, ever been asked in any of these meetings about this project. We know it needs willows, willow thickets, freshwater willow thickets. Why aren't those kinds of questions being asked? What do these species need? That's never been asked. And that's what needs to be asked. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask all of you who have, or who still want to speak, to get in line. And I will look for your card. When you state your name, you'll each get 1 minute, and I suggest that you just try to come up with a way to say what it is you want. Okay? So just get in line in any form, I don't care. And then I'll just find your ticket.
Yes, and I do have a presentation.
No. 1 minute?
It'll only take a minute.
Okay, you can have that.
Okay. Could I get layout? And while they're waiting to bring this up, I just want to say the theme of my presentation was going to be the echo chamber that exists at Ballona. I can't begin to say how disappointed I am in the way this meeting was formatted. Clearly, the design was to cement a narrative in your heads before the first word in rebuttal. I think that's disappointing. I'm going to take my limited time to talk about just one slide. And this is, I blocked the name out, but it's the woman who spoke to you from the Bay Foundation, Korrina Johnston, restoration ecologist for the Santa Monica Bay Restoration Commission, a state agency, is among those who have known about these drains for several years while studying the existing ecology of the wetlands in preparation for developing a restoration plan. She says the PVC drain has been out there as long as we've been monitoring. We have photos from it from back in 2008. To my understanding, from comments from the consultants who assisted in the building of the freshwater marsh, the Playa Vista consultants, I'll wait till you guys are done. Okay. These are permitted overflow pipes that don't drain the wetland in the way that the media is projecting. They are only in the area between Culver and Jefferson, and they're there to prevent the flooding of the Jefferson and the surrounding areas in the storm events. And I'm done, and I would just say again, this was incredibly disappointing.
I'm sorry you're disappointed. Who's next?
Okay, my name is Cindy Hardin. I am the Director of Outdoor Education for the Los Angeles Audubon Society, which I've heard a lot of social justice, environmental justice being mentioned today. We provide field trips for children from underserved schools, about 2,500 a year. So through my job, I have this unique opportunity to be at Ballona quite a bit. Obviously, I had more to say, but in my time limit, I will say that this rainy year, and I've distributed an article to all of you about that, served to remind us all of the fresh water that was and is present at the wetlands right now. We didn't even, the rain this year was 18 inches, 15 is the average, so it wasn't even like a huge year. I advocate for more fresh water being directed into the wetlands as part of an alternative offered in the revised EIR. There are freshwater species present right now, including chorus frogs that are still singing, and this is a habitat that we need to enhance rather than flood with salt water. Thank you.
And I think that was a very good way to present. You said you'd rather have fresh water than salt water. Makes it very clear. Go ahead. Next point.
Thank you. Hello, Commissioners. My name is Molly Baszler. I'm a climate reality leader, environmentalist activist, and I too support the freshwater rather than the saltwater, leaving Ballona as it is, but exiting the gas fields, the gas storage. You know, as you know, the UN just came out with a new report in regard to biodiversity, IPCC about climate change, that we only have 10 to 12 years. It's really important that we keep sacred spaces, and if we start to bulldoze all of that, carbon is released because there's carbon in the soil. And it's also killing habitat. Why not keep it as is and get rid of the storage space? So I support keeping Ballona as it is, not bulldozing. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Edith Reed. I manage the Ballona freshwater wetland system. I've done so for the past 13 years. I don't fall on either side of the freshwater or saltwater debate. I just want a diverse native ecosystem back and functioning. And I should correct, earlier the treated groundwater that's done by Playa Vista is not thrown away. It's sent down a riparian corridor that had been created and beginning in 2010 provided habitat for the least bells vireo.
Thank you. Name?
I'm Rex Frankel. I have slides.
Got 1 minute.
Basically, I support a freshwater alternative at the Ballona Wetlands. The slide presentation, which if we can get it up here, we expected more time. Basically, the proponents of bulldozing the Ballona Wetlands have stated specifically that the US EPA and their TMDL for sediment removal at the Ballona Wetlands said that the Ballona Wetlands were a salt marsh. 70% of the Ballona Wetlands were historically a salt marsh. If you go to the next slide, you'll see, continue next slide. And that's where they say vegetated wetland is 70% in the middle there. But if you go to the next page and read the text, it says historically 70% of the Ballona Wetlands was composed of vegetated marsh, which was salt marsh, brackish, fresh, and seasonal wetlands. It was not just salt marsh. And that's why we're advocating a balanced ecosystem that has all the natural habitats in it, not just exclusively salt marsh. That's the problem with the state's proposal, is it's almost entirely salt marsh. We want a balanced ecosystem. We don't want a monoculture. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Name? Come on.
Leslie Purcell, I'd like to donate to Margot Griswold. She's
Okay,
a
what was your
scientist.
name?
Leslie Purcell.
Okay. So 2 minutes for
Hello,
Margot.
Margot Griswold, restoration ecologist. I actually did the analysis for McGuire Thomas on whether they could have that riparian corridor. So I know something about Ballona. I also know something about restoration. And I also favor a more balanced approach than just the three alternatives that have been presented for the EIR consideration. I'd like to look more at freshwater. And I join with others, such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in looking for opportunities to create a larger contiguous area of habitat for wildlife, rather than the current proposed alternative that increased flood protection in the form of these massive constructed berms to protect existing roadways and utilities in their current location. Why are we doing that? We're encouraging the long-term fragmentation of Ballona. Let's bring it together. Let's look at a real resilience to sea level rise, lift up on a causeway culvert, and connect the wetlands. And that's what I would like to look at, a real alternative, and we haven't seen that. And I'm also president of Los Angeles Audubon Society, and our comments on the EIR have been presented by our lawyer.
Thank you very much. Name?
Hello, thank you for letting me talk. I'm Marilyn Fuss of Los Angeles, and I'm ceding my time to Mark Salzberg.
Okay. I got you here. 2 minutes.
Thank you, Commissioners. I'm Mark Salzberg. You have before you a resolution from the LA County Democratic Party. This resolution was put together and is opposed to the proposed restoration. The reasons stated for opposing it are stated in the resolution. All I wanted to say about it was that this resolution was really carefully considered. It had over 100 hours of research done. They had a hearing that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife testified at. After hearing all of that, they went ahead and voted to oppose the wetlands proposal. The other thing I wanted to say was about sea level rise. And the interesting thing about this project is that it proposes to remove levees that surround Ballona Creek. If those levees are left in place and sea level goes up, the sea level rise is actually contained within the levees. If you tear the levees down, that's what allows the salt water to intrude into the rest of the wetlands. The crazy thing about this is that because they want to remove the levees, the entire project will be underwater by their own projections in 2100. So it's approximately 200 million by the time they start that's going to be just gone. All that's going to be left is going to be new berms that they have to build in place of the levees that they remove to protect structures. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next. Your name, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Diane Fletcher Hoppy. I live in Marina del Rey. And I'm a member of the Protect Playa Now coalition of neighbors who are wanting to protect Playa and the wetlands. I live 1 mile from the wetlands. There are serious scientific differences. Let's not ignore them. Let's not put our head in the sand and just go forward with a pre-decided idea. Clearly, there are serious differences. Clearly, please listen to them. We are told they need restoration, the wetlands. If this is so, we must apply the Hippocratic Oath to the Ballona Wetlands Restoration Project. In healing someone, the doctor must first and foremost do no harm. This bulldozing project is supposedly to help the Ballona wetlands heal, but there has been no clear evidence. There's no hydrology study.
Thank you, ma'am. Time's up. Next.
My name is Jonathan Coffin. I'm a I love Ballona Wetlands. I visit it all the time, and my love for the Ballona Wetlands brings me in there with my camera all the time to document what's there. One of the things you wouldn't have known about had I not photographed the drains being submerged completely with water, and then the water the next day going down into the culvert, down to the Ballona Creek, and then for the next weeks, spouts of water coming out into the weep holes from the soils for weeks. And this was the loss of water for 2 rain events. Finally, they capped it, which was a great thing, finally, but they should remove the drains. And this is another thing. These are Lisbell's vireo. It's an endangered bird. It's occupying both sides of Ballona Creek, Area A and Area B, not the freshwater marsh. The second year in a row, they're occupying the laurel sumac that grows there. There's also mule fat and other native plants that they are documented as using anyway. So that's the importance of the place. It's intact there today.
Thank you.
Open our eyes.
Next. Come on.
Good late afternoon.
Yes.
Thank you very much for letting me address you. My name is Patricia Eunice, and I'm here representing the Pacific Ocean Management, the owners of Fisherman's Village. I come today to pose a question to you. When two state agencies collide in a matter that significantly affects coastal access, how do you respond? How should you respond? Recent actions by Fish and Game have collided head-on with the mandates of the California Coastal Act. Fish and Game, at the urging of certain community members, have forced the eviction of the Fisherman's Village employees from the parking lot located in Area A, directly across from Fisherman's Village. These employees occupy just 53 spaces, 1/3 of the available area. Not evicted are the Los Angeles County employees. They continue to park in the lot. After just a few weeks, the negative impact on public access has been dramatic.
Thank you.
People are being turned away.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Next, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Knight. I've been volunteering for 26 years now to save this precious last wetland. I used to be a social worker protecting children, and I switched to protecting wildlife and plants because they're becoming so rare. Recently, there was a report by United Nations on the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services that said 1 million species are threatened with extinction. And the loss is due to humans, with species loss now occurring to tens to hundreds of times faster than it has in the past. The key reason is loss of habitat. The report found that more than 500,000 species on land have insufficient habitat for long-term survival and could disappear within decades without habitat restoration. Another study has shown that 85% of wetlands in the world have been destroyed, and over 95% of California's wetlands have been destroyed. Please help us save the original natural wetlands left in California with a slow, natural restoration that respects all the species out there, not bulldozing. Thank you.
Name, please.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Richard Harmel. I'm speaking on behalf of a freshwater Ballona, and I speak for Sierra Club Los Angeles Chapter Airport Marina Executive Committee. I would like you to overlay your analysis of this discussion we're having with two things. The pro restoration is hammering away at the deteriorating, declining, impaired wetland system. I propose to you that the reason for that condition that's been happening over the past 20 years is due to the conscientious and intentional diversion, dewatering, and discharging of fresh water from the Ballona wetlands into either sanitary sewers or into the Ballona Creek. Number two, their second linchpin argument is that the dredging from the marina was intentionally left on Area A in order to
No, go ahead, finish your sentence.
in order to fill the Ballona. They have one photograph, and their interpretation is that that's why that was happening.
Okay.
In fact, what was happening is that the dredgings were left to dry out and be placed elsewhere to increase the beach 450 feet out, as well as to fill the moles, to build all the residences there. Thank you for your additional time.
Thank you. And obviously, this matter is going to come before us fairly soon. Well, Jack, when do you think we'll be hearing this as a...
It's probably not going to be in the near future.
No, not too soon.
No.
Because, and obviously, all of these issues that they bring up about freshwater, saltwater, all of that stuff is being examined.
That's right. This
We're
was
not
just to
ignoring
help you all understand
Okay,
the
so
context
please,
of what's
you
going
all
on.
will come back, I know, when this is in front of us, but I really appreciate your energy and your interest, and thank you all.